separately, but that's a separate conversation, right? Just because you're okay under these laws, it's not mean you're okay under some other law.
Hi, my name is Matt, and I'm an investor in Bitcoin startups. And the biggest one I'm looking at right now is the Bitcoin ATMs. And so I have one question I'm going to ask in a few different ways. Is you said regulation starts at $1, but on an ATM model, if you could cap it at $1,000 per user per day, would it be less regulated than if they were just doing a small amount of transaction? And the exact question from the founder, legal aspects, is if the $1,000 per person per day threshold as an MSB even matters in the bilateral ATM model, or is it irrelevant because the model would be considered a money transmitter and thus an MSB by default? And then I think it sounds like they're touching on the prepaid regime.
Well, there's two, right? I mean, we didn't lay the table very well for the audience, but you're either a money transmitter, you're a seller or prepaid access, you're a dealer or an exchange, like foreign exchange. And there are dollar amounts, like $1,000 per day per person if you're dealing in two fiat currencies, exchanging two fiat currencies, or if it is your prepaid access. But I think, if you get my opinion, open to everybody else here, but my opinion is that it's pretty clear that a Bitcoin is a virtual currency which triggers the money transmitter law. If it can trigger anything, it triggers that, and it's $1.
And there's a difference between whether or not you're regulated and whether or not you have to report. So there are suspicious activity and cash transaction thresholds. I might be regulated, but whether or not I have to report it may depend on certain dollar thresholds. But just because I didn't meet that dollar threshold doesn't mean I'm not regulated. The two don't necessarily go together.
That makes sense.
I mean, they aren't separate.
That makes sense. So what you're saying is you're going to be under the same amount of regulation whether you're dealing with $1 or $10,000, but the amount of reporting that you're going to have to do, there are thresholds based on the dollar amounts.
As a money transmitter, that's true. If we're talking about dealer foreign exchange or prepaid access, then you don't even enter into that regulatory regime if you stay under certain dollar amounts, right? And so that's why, frankly, a lot of my clients were caught off guard. If you thought about what Bitcoin was, it was not unreasonable to reach the conclusion that it was prepaid access, right? But it's not.
I can't tell you what the law is on that, but I can tell you what I would need if a Bitcoin ATM wanted to join my exchange. And anybody who's doing that kind of business, we'd love to have you, but what we need to see first is your AML policy and is an opinion from someone like Dax or Carol about how you're regulated. And we'd have to see that you're pursuing that you're regulated that way. And so in businesses in the space, it's not just about persuading the regulator, and it's not just about persuading the banks, it's also about persuading your partners. If you have a Bitcoin ATM where you put in dollars and it sells Bitcoin, you need to buy them somewhere. And if the person you're buying them from doesn't understand your business, then both of you are at serious risk.
See, but it is possible, for instance, to put a machine like that behind a counter or with an agent network. I mean, there's still process to comply with the law, right? It's just that you leave it out in the open and nobody's monitoring it, like ID verification, then it's hard.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Ryan, you have amazing customer service. Validated a few times. Do you have any final thoughts, any opinions that you could throw at me just about a Bitcoin ATM?
Comment.
If I might add, many jurisdictions have laws that regulate the use of ATMs, so you probably want to take a look at those and make sure it's working. And then to go back to the point that Ryan just said, which I think is something that has been an undercurrent, but not fully, you were bringing it out, is that we've been focusing on the Bank Secrecy Act and whether you are subject to those record-keeping reporting requirements. But there is the federal criminal statutes that prohibit money laundering. And often, and this is in fact what happened in the Eagle case, is they focused too much on whether the Bank Secrecy Act applied and didn't focus on the fact that the money laundering criminal statutes apply to everyone. And that's where you need to have a good AML compliance program in place, even if you're not required by Bank Secrecy Act to have one, so that you can be monitoring what's happening with your customer
So
base.
there's different sets of regulations to apply to.
Right, but this is something that applies to everyone, whether the Bank Secrecy Act applies to you or not.
Everybody can be prosecuted for money laundering, that's what she's saying, sure. So no money laundering.
It's interesting. I mean, people get a little bit, tend to get a little bit frustrated with sort of the uncertainty, right, of this industry. But go back and read about, and I'm not endorsing the way they did this, but go back and read about the PayPal saga and how many and how that went. And I mean, I think that's a reasonable, that course of action, I mean, that sort of process, it's a reasonable length of time. I don't know what the total from start to finish was, but before it sort of was resolved.
And I would just add that I think as much as everyone here is grappling with these issues, I'm sure people at FinCEN and all these government agencies are trying to figure their way through the same issues. And so, for example, going back to this seizure warrant, I mean, they went with what was easy, which is line on bank form. It's the easiest thing, low-hanging fruit, as Dak said. So I think, there's a struggle on both ends involving, the regulatory regime, and then probably, truthfully, down the road on what's really criminal activity here. When a prosecutor has a lot of discretion to decide, is this really criminal activity, or is this more of a civil thing where they should be fined? And I think one of the things I've thought about through this is that banks get fined all the time under criminal statutes, like HSBC last year.
What was the fine there?
Over $1 billion for violating a ton of things, including not having a good anti-money laundering compliance program. MoneyGram got fined $100 million last year. But you didn't hear about anybody going to prison because those are big institutional corporations that have been around for a long time. And it's probably very hard to figure out if one person was at fault, whereas a lot of the businesses here are much more personal. They're smaller and they're startups. And I think if you're a prosecutor, it's much easier to look at HSBC, maybe not prosecute a person, but when you're looking at a company that has 3 people and they're screwing stuff up left and right, it's much easier to prosecute an individual, not just the company.
So get Brian's card.
I think when you're talking to these lawyers, another thing you need to look for is you're not looking for a way out of the regulations. The lawyers give you a way out of the regulations, they're bad lawyers. What you're looking for instead is what are the regulations that most make sense? What are the regulators that are really happy to hear from you? How do you follow those to a very, very high standard? And so it's not about finding a way to run your business the way you want to run your business. It's finding a way to run your business the way that will allow your business to be run for 10 years because of the way they want you to run your business.
So, Ryan, I think I may be a bad lawyer. but I am, I do think there's a little tape, by the way. Okay. So I'll restate it. I may be a bad lawyer. I think it's important to know that there's a sandbox. There are statutes and regulations, and there's letter rulings, and they're very specific, right? It's important to figure out whether the laws do apply or they don't apply. If they don't apply, they legitimately don't apply, and there's some sort of trend or good argument, then you should use that, right? If there's a clarification, you got to go get it. But I should say, you can't go too far. If it's so close to the line, you got to assume, it's intended to cover it. And so don't play games. But if it legitimately doesn't cover you, and often technology is ahead of the law, you don't have the answer, then there is room for clarification, for lobbying, for explanations.
I think that's exactly the problem this whole industry faces, is the technology ran away from out of the law so fast that we're not the only ones having these panels. The UK just had a conference where it was every money regulator in the UK, and they got together and they talked about Bitcoin for a weekend.
Yeah, look, a lot of the state regulations are, regarding prepaid, a lot of the state laws regarding prepaid acts, what we call, what other, stored value or prepaid access, gift cards, or actually states still use gifts. I mean, a lot of states still use gift certificates. I haven't seen a gift certificate in a really long time, but so yeah, it definitely runs. But you don't plan on, I'll just add to what that's saying, don't plan on winning